When you agree to pay an actor or a crew member on a deferred basis, it means that you won't pay them during or immediately after the shoot. Instead, you'll pay them only if a specific event happens. In other words, some event that's specified in the contract. What event is that? It might be when the movie makes a profit, when it gets a distribution deal, or something else. Generally, it's up to you and the person you're negotiating with, that is the actor or the crew member, to determine what the triggering event is going to be that causes the deferred pay to be owed. And of course, other things like the amount of the deferred pay and so forth. Some people say that actors shouldn't accept this kind of arrangement because if the production company can't afford to pay them up front, it's probably not going to earn the necessary profit or the necessary money later on to pay them the deferred payment that they're owed. Some people say that for actors who are early in their career, this provides a good solution. It allows people who otherwise wouldn't have been able to make a film to make one. And it allows actors to get credits and footage for their reel and so forth, even in the event that the filmmaker doesn't become able to pay them deferred pay. So there are differing viewpoints on whether this is fair and whether this is a good idea. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to put that concern aside, and I'm going to talk about how to make deferred pay happen in your contracts. So how do you make this happen in a contract with your cast and crew members? I'll talk about a few common approaches to doing this and the necessary contract language. And I'll also talk about other important considerations that you should think about if you're thinking about offering deferred pay to your cast or crew members. Number one, deferred payments paid out of the film's profits. One common approach is to say that the deferred payment will be made out of the production company's profits if and when the production company actually makes a profit on the film. The devil tends to be in the details as far as this method is concerned, because the meaning of profit tends to be very specifically defined in agreements that provide for deferred pay of this type. By the way, I did a pretty in-depth discussion of the legal ins and outs of sharing the profits from your film as a form of compensating cast and crew members for the film, if you want to check that out. Here's one example of a contract that takes the approach of awarding deferred pay out of profits from the film when they eventually materialize. So here, to translate from legalese, this provision says that for every day the actor works on set, they'll earn $206 worth of deferred compensation. The production company will pay the actor any deferred compensation they owe if, first, the company earns what are called gross collections, and two, any other people who are entitled to shares of gross collections before the actor get paid. In other words, people who have a higher priority right to receive gross collections. But what are gross collections? Let's look at Exhibit A to the agreement to find out. Exhibit A starts by saying that adjusted gross receipts means essentially all proceeds that are earned from the commercial exploitation of the film. So all money that's made through the presentation of the film in any form, excluding a few specific items such as product placement money and distributor advances. Then we go to the next section, which says that after we calculate adjusted gross receipts, we subtract all distribution fees, expenses, and taxes to get what's called gross collections, which we referred to earlier. Gross collections essentially are the profits from the film. Now, gross collections get paid out to various people associated with the film in a particular order of priority, or what's called a waterfall. In other words, the person at the top of this list, who's a tax intermediary, gets paid first. And if there's any gross collections left, the next person gets paid, which is the collection agent. Then the sales agent gets paid, and the money continues downward through the waterfall. After the sales agent gets paid, if there are any profits left, they're used for quote-unquote payment of deferments. That includes the kind of deferred compensation that we're talking about, the deferred pay that was promised to the actor or the crew member in their contract. So in other words, if there are profits left after the tax intermediary, the collections agent, and the sales agent get their cuts, they'll be used to pay deferred compensation to the actor in this example. This example brings up an important point, which is that there's a difference between offering people solely deferred pay and not paying them any sort of fee upfront, and on the other hand, giving them some upfront payment and also giving them a share of the profits. You notice that in this agreement, people who are promised deferred pay get paid before investors and before any cast and crew who get shares of profits in addition to upfront fees. If you look at subsection G here, it says that after everyone else who's further up in the profit waterfall has been paid, the investors and producers, talent, and crew finally start to see shares of the profits. The producers, talent, and crew who are referred to here presumably are people who didn't get paid on a deferred basis. In other words, they got paid some amount of money up front, but in addition to that upfront money, they also got the right to participate in the movie's profits. And that seems like a fair approach. The people who got nothing upfront and only get deferred pay are getting paid before the people who got something upfront and are promised shares of profits in the future. This agreement does go into a lot of detail about how profits are calculated, but generally speaking, I think that's a good idea. The more specific you are about an issue like that, the less likely that there's going to be a dispute about who gets to be paid first and how profits are defined, whether things like product placement revenues or distributor advances and so forth are supposed to be included in the profits that get paid out and so forth. And it's a good idea to avoid those kinds of disputes because that helps you avoid litigation, which obviously can be very costly and painful, or just having to deal with the headache of sending nasty emails back and forth with people who you'd rather not be having conflict with. So now let's talk about a second possible way to determine when the cast and crew members are going to receive deferred pay, which is to say it'll be paid when the movie gets a distribution deal and the production company makes enough money from that deal to start paying back the deferred amounts that it owes. Here's an example of a contract provision that makes that happen. So this provision says that the actor will get $206 per day if what's called an acquisition event happens. What is an acquisition event? It means that a distributor pays the production company for the right to show the film, and all of the money that's owed to the producers, perhaps for their own deferred pay, is paid in full. After those two things happen, the actor will get their deferred payment. What are the pros and cons of this approach? One point in its favor is that it's simpler than the profit-based approach that we saw earlier. We don't need a long list that shows the priority order in which people are going to receive shares of profits in order to understand how this scheme works. One possible con is that there are ways this contract provision could be seen as ambiguous, and that's because it is phrased in such simple terms. Specifically, if we look at the definition of an acquisition event, it talks about a distributor getting the right to exhibit the project in any medium in exchange for quote-unquote monetary compensation. But what is monetary compensation? Does it mean that the distributor needs to pay money up front to the production company, like if the distributor pays an advance in return for foreign pre-sale rights or something of that nature, which sometimes happens in distribution deals? Or does it include situations in which there is no advance, but the distributor just pays some money to the company that's made in the ordinary course of business? In other words, the distributor gets some money as a result of audiences watching the film, whether in theaters or online or whatever, and then pays a share of that money to the production company. One reason why you see detailed definitions of deferred compensation, profits, and other terms relating to how people will be paid is to avoid ambiguities like this, which again can create the kind of disputes that you don't want to deal with the hassle of. And that's really a key purpose of contracts, to make the best effort possible to avoid the need for hassle and expensive litigation if there's a falling out between the parties. So we've talked about a couple of approaches to drafting a contract provision that provides for deferred pay. Now let's talk about a couple of other points to remember when you're thinking about awarding deferred compensation to your cast and crew. Number 3, make sure that it's clear that no money is going to be paid up front. In the second sample contract provision that we looked at earlier, you may have noticed that there's a clause saying, for the avoidance of doubt, if no acquisition event as defined above occurs, company shall have no obligation to pay any monetary compensation to artist. In other words, if an acquisition event doesn't happen, the actor won't get paid. Some people sign agreements without reading them very carefully. I know that I've worked on some productions where the actors will sign an agreement saying that their only compensation is going to be deferred pay, and then they come back after the shoot is done and they demand to know where their money is. So it's important to spell out in very clear terms in your contract when you're offering deferred pay that whoever is signing is not going to get any money at all until whatever condition that triggers the deferred pay is met. In other words, when a profit is made or when a distribution deal is reached or something like that. You might even want to put that in bold and underline. Number 4, make sure your union agreements allow deferred pay. When you're thinking about whether to offer deferred pay to your cast and crew, it's important to think about whether there are union people involved in your production and whether the union agreements you've entered into in order to work with those people allow them to be paid on a deferred basis. Take SAG-AFTRA, the actors union, for example. There are 3 SAG-AFTRA agreements, as of the date of this video at least, that allow actors to be given deferred pay. And those are the short project agreement, the new media agreement, and the micro budget agreement. If your project is subject to a different SAG-AFTRA agreement, such as the SAG low budget theatrical agreement, you won't be able to offer deferred pay to the SAG actors or actually to any actors who are working on your film. Also, even if the union agreement you're proceeding under allows you to offer deferred pay, there might be certain conditions that the agreement places on offering deferred pay, such as requiring a minimum amount of deferred pay per day, for example. So definitely review your union agreements, or ideally have your lawyer do it, to see what kind of restrictions or conditions are placed by those agreements on the production company's ability to pay people on a deferred basis. So those are some important considerations to take into account when you're thinking about offering deferred pay to your cast and crew members. Of course, none of this is legal advice, because as I always say, if I were giving you legal advice, I would need to understand your individual situation and your individual needs. And at least for our purposes right now, I'm just a lawyer talking to you on the internet. If you appreciated this content, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to this channel so that I can bring you more useful entertainment law educational content in the future.